I spent 2 years restoring my in-laws' desert motel for free. On the day it reopened, they gave the deed to my wife's cousin and said, he'll bring real passion to it. My wife just smiled. You hate the desert, she said. I drove off with grease on my hands, and the contract they forgot I'd had them sign. My name is Sam. I'm 42 years old, and I live in Colorado Springs, Colorado. I've been working as an auto mechanic since I was a teenager. It's not glamorous, but it pays the bills and keeps my hands busy. Elena came to me with the idea one night after dinner. She was sitting across from me, swirling a glass of red wine, her eyes bright with excitement. Sam, I've been thinking about the old motel in Taos, she said, her voice soft but urgent. You remember it, don't you? My parents used to take me there every summer. Of course I remembered. She told me stories about it before, the rundown place with a cracked pool and neon sign that flickered in the wind. I'd never been there myself, but I'd heard enough to picture it, all sun-bleached desert and broken dreams. I was thinking, she continued, maybe we could bring it back to life. Fix it up. Turn it into something special. A little desert lodge for travelers, you know? I raised an eyebrow. A desert lodge? Elena, you know I'm not a desert guy. I'm a mountain man. I like trees and snow, not heat and sand. She reached across the table and took my hand. I know, Sam, but it's not just a project. It's my childhood. It could be a legacy, ours, if we do it together. My parents would finally see you as part of the family. That got my attention. I'd spent years trying to feel like I belonged in her family, always a little on the outside. Elena's folks, Victor and Joanne, were city people with soft hands and hard opinions. They'd never said it outright, but I knew they thought I wasn't good enough for her. Maybe this could change that. Still, I hesitated. What's in it for us? I asked. I mean, your folks own the place, right? Are they just going to let us sink our savings and sweat into it for free? Elena leaned back, her eyes steady. I've already talked to them. They'll sign an agreement. Once the motel is fully restored and turning a profit, they'll transfer half the ownership to us. It'll be ours too, Sam. Half of it. That was a promise I could grab onto. They'll put it in writing? I asked, and she nodded. In writing. We'll make it official. I felt something shift in my chest then, something like hope but quieter. All right, I said. But I'm drawing up that agreement myself. I'm not taking anyone's word for it. She grinned and leaned over to kiss me. Thank you, Sam. You won't regret this. A week later, I was standing in Victor and Joanne's dusty motel office, the air heavy with stale heat and memories. I spread the papers out on the cracked Formica counter. It's a simple agreement, I said, handing Victor a pen. Partial ownership transfers to us once the renovation is complete and the business is running again. Clear and fair. Victor looked at me, his expression hard to read. Joanne hovered beside him, biting her lip. All right, Victor said finally, signing his name with a flourish that seemed almost dismissive. Joanne signed too, though she avoided my eyes. I felt a knot in my stomach loosen as I took the signed papers back. I wasn't stupid. I knew this wasn't a guarantee of love or respect, but it was something concrete. A promise. Elena squeezed my arm as we walked back to the car. This is going to be great, Sam. You'll see. I wanted to believe her. I really did. But as I looked out at the dusty parking lot, the cracked windows and sagging roofline of the motel, I felt a twinge of doubt. It wasn't just the desert that made me uneasy. It was the feeling that I was stepping into something bigger than just a renovation job. Still, I nodded and started the car. All right, I said. Let's bring this place back to life. And that was that. I was all in, clinging to the belief that family would do right by me. 2 years of my life, my sweat, my weekends, all for the chance to build something that finally felt like it belonged to me. Even if part of me wondered, as we drove back to Colorado Springs that night, if it was all just a distant promise. The first time I walked into that old motel, it was like stepping into a ghost town. The air was thick with dust, and the stale smell of sun-baked carpet clung to my clothes. I stood in the doorway, staring at the faded turquoise paint and cracked tile floors, and I couldn't help but wonder if I'd lost my damn mind. Every weekend for the next 2 years, I loaded up my truck and made the 6-hour drive from Colorado Springs to Taos. I'd start before sunrise, the mountain chill biting at my cheeks, and by the time I reached the desert, the sun would be a hammer overhead. I'd never liked the desert, never understood how people could stand the heat and the grit in their teeth. But I kept going. I started with the basics, wiring, plumbing, patching up leaks, and replacing old fixtures. There were days when the only sound was the scrape of my hammer and the hiss of sweat rolling down my back. I took photos of every stage, labeled each with the date and what I'd done that day. I kept every receipt, every little scrap of proof that this was my work, not just some favor for the family. Elena was there, at first. She'd show up on Fridays, her car loaded with iced coffee and sandwiches, her face bright with optimism. She'd talk about the future of the motel, how she could see it all, a neon sign buzzing back to life, quirky desert-themed rooms, even a little roadside diner where travelers would stop for pie. She painted a picture so vivid I almost believed it. But somewhere along the way, she stopped coming as much. She'd say she was busy with work or her parents needed her around. "I'll come next weekend," she'd promise over the phone. "I'm just swamped right now." Her voice would sound tight, like she was already somewhere else. I tried to brush it off. We were in this together, or at least that's what I kept telling myself. I'd work alone, sanding the sun-bleached wood of the doors or scraping old paint off the pool's cracked tiles. When I looked up and saw the sky turning that hazy desert pink, I'd close my eyes and try to imagine it finished, tourists checking in, kids splashing in the pool, laughter echoing across the lot. But as the months rolled by, Elena's phone calls got shorter. She'd ask how things were going, but she never wanted details. When I asked about the agreement, the one that promised we'd own half once it was all done, she'd change the subject or say, "We'll talk about it later." That should have been a red flag, I guess. But I was too far in. I'd already spent every weekend there, my hands raw and my back aching. I'd sunk everything into that place, money, time, sweat, and I didn't want to see it as a mistake. Sometimes, late at night, I'd sit on the edge of one of the motel's beds, the mattress lumpy and the air still too warm to sleep, and I'd wonder if I was being played for a fool. I'd remember Victor's smirk as he signed the papers, Joanne's tight smile, and Elena's bright eyes, promising me the world. But then the next morning, I'd pull on my work boots and tell myself it didn't matter. This was my chance to build something real, something I could point to and say, "I did this." Something that proved I was more than just the quiet guy who fixed cars in a mountain town. One Saturday, about a year and a half in, I finally got the old pool running again. It was nothing fancy, just a rectangular hole in the ground, really, but seeing it full of water, blue and shimmering in the heat, felt like a small victory. I snapped a picture and sent it to Elena. "Looks amazing." She texted back, "I'll come see it soon." But she never did. By the time I hit the 2-year mark, the motel looked like a whole new place. Fresh paint, new plumbing, a neon sign that flickered back to life at dusk. I kept a journal of everything, every expense, every hour I spent there. It was my way of keeping myself honest, of making sure no one could say I hadn't earned my share. But in the back of my mind, there was a nagging voice I couldn't shut out. The voice that whispered maybe I was working for a promise that would never come true. I kept going anyway, because I had to believe that family would do right by me, that all this sweat and sand would be worth it in the end. By the time the grand reopening rolled around, I poured every ounce of myself into that place. The motel looked nothing like the wreck I'd first walked into. The walls were bright and clean, the neon sign buzzed with life again, and the pool was sparkling under the desert sun. It felt like I'd finally brought Elena's childhood memories back to life. The day of the celebration, Elena insisted we throw a big desert-themed barbecue. She wanted it to feel authentic and welcoming. "We'll show everyone how far we've come," she said, her voice full of excitement that hadn't been there in months. Friends and family started showing up in the late afternoon, the sun already dropping low and turning the sky a warm orange. I was sweating through my shirt, tending to the grill out back, flipping burgers and ribs like a man who'd finally reached the finish line. Elena floated around like the perfect hostess, greeting everyone with hugs and bright smiles. Victor and Joe sat at a table near the pool, cold beers in hand, chatting with neighbors about how the motel had come back from the dead. I tried to ignore the way Victor kept talking like he'd been out there with me every weekend, sweat in his eyes and dirt under his nails. I was just about to start setting up the speakers for some music when Derek showed up. He was Elena's cousin, a guy I'd met only a handful of times. Always struck me as the type who thought he was destined for more than he was willing to work for. Derek strolled in wearing a dusty leather jacket and a pair of sunglasses he didn't bother to take off, even as the sun set. He moved through the crowd like he owned the place, laughing too loud and dropping names I'd never heard of. When he found Elena, he slung an arm around her shoulders and started talking about some big plans he had for a music career that had never gotten past open mic nights. I didn't like it. Not one bit. But I told myself it was just a party, and Derek was just another guest. As the evening wore on, we gathered everyone near the pool for speeches. Elena stepped forward first, her hair shining in the last bit of sun, her voice warm and sweet. She talked about her childhood memories at the motel, how much it meant to her and her family. I watched her, feeling that tug in my chest again, the one that had kept me going through every blister and busted pipe. Then Victor raised his glass. "To family," he said, his voice booming across the courtyard. "To dreams reborn." He paused, looking around with that sly grin he always wore when he thought he was about to impress someone. "And to the new caretaker of this beautiful place, my nephew Derek." There was a moment where it felt like the world stopped. My brain couldn't process the words. I looked at Elena, waiting for her to correct him, to tell everyone that this was supposed to be ours, hers and mine. But she didn't say a word. She just smiled and gave a little shrug. "You don't even like the desert, Sam," she said softly, as if that explained everything. I stood there, the sounds of the party blurring around me. Laughter, music, the sizzle of the grill, it all felt far away. I tried to swallow down the bile rising in my throat. Victor clapped Derek on the back, Derek raising his beer and bowing like some kind of conquering hero. My hands were shaking, and I felt like if I didn't move, I'd break something. I turned and walked through the motel office door, the cool air hitting my face like a slap. I knew exactly where Victor kept the safe, tucked in the back closet. My hands didn't even hesitate as I punched in the code. The contract, my contract, was right where I'd left it. I pulled it out, folded it up, and stuck it in my back pocket. My heart was hammering, but I didn't care. I wasn't about to let them erase me completely. When I stepped back outside, no one noticed. They were too busy toasting Derek, too busy laughing and posing for photos in front of the sign I'd spend hours repainting. I didn't say goodbye. I didn't say a word. I just walked to my truck, the night desert air thick and heavy around me. As I pulled away from the motel, I watched the party fade in the rearview mirror. It felt like the final nail in a coffin I didn't even realize they'd been building around me. All I could think was, so this is how it ends. But deep down, I knew it wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The drive back to Colorado Springs felt like it took years. I couldn't stop thinking about the way Elena had shrugged, like it was nothing. Like I was nothing. By the time I pulled into my driveway, my hands were still gripping the wheel so hard my knuckles ached. I didn't even go inside. I just sat there in the truck, staring at the contract in my lap. My signature. Victor's signature. Clear as day. My name written in black ink, as real as the sweat and blood I poured into that place. The next morning, I called Henry. He was an old friend, someone I'd known since high school, and he'd gone to law school while I was learning how to tear apart engines and put them back together. He'd always been the guy with the answers, the one who never let anyone push him around. When I told him what happened, he didn't even pause. Bring everything over, Sam. Every receipt, every photo, every email. If they think they're just gonna erase you, they're in for a hell of a surprise. I spent that whole night going through my boxes. The receipts were all there, every last dollar I'd spent at that motel. The journals I'd kept, each entry dated and signed. Pictures of the broken-down shell it used to be, and the bright, clean lodge I'd turned it into. It felt like I was piecing together a map of my own heartbreak. Henry read through the contract 3 times before he finally sat back in his chair. This isn't just a promise, Sam, he said quietly. This is a binding agreement. They can't just decide to hand it off to Derek like you're nobody. He was calm, but I could feel the anger simmering under his words. It was the same anger I'd been trying to keep down, the same fire that had kept me going through all those long drives and hot desert days. Elena called me 2 days later. Her voice was soft, almost like she was trying to be gentle. Sam, please, she said, don't drag the family through court. You know how this will tear everyone apart. I didn't even raise my voice. Elena, I said, you already tore it apart. You just didn't think I'd fight back. She went quiet for a second. Then she said, I didn't mean for it to go this far. But I could tell by the way her voice shook that she was lying. She'd meant every bit of it. Derek didn't waste any time, either. He started telling anyone who'd listened that I was unhinged, that I was just some angry mechanic who'd snapped because he couldn't handle not being the center of attention. He posted pictures from the reopening party, shots of him standing in front of the motel sign like he'd built the place himself. Victor and Joanne joined right in. Joanne told mutual friends that I'd always been a little unstable, that I was obsessive, and couldn't let go of something that never really belonged to me. Victor, of course, said I was greedy, that I was just in it for the money. I tried to ignore it, but it wasn't easy. One night, I came out of the grocery store and found a long, jagged scratch running down the side of my truck. I stood there in the parking lot, the wind cutting cold against my face, and I just stared at it. I knew exactly what it meant. The family war had started, and I was in the middle of it whether I liked it or not. But even as the rumors spread, even as Elena's family painted me like some villain in a story they'd written without me, I didn't back down. I had the contract. I had the proof. And I had Henry in my corner, steady as a rock. We filed a lawsuit 2 weeks later. Breach of contract. Unjust enrichment. Everything we needed to make it clear that I wasn't going to just walk away. Henry told me, it's going to get ugly, Sam. But you're in the right. Don't let them scare you off. I didn't. Because for the first time in my life, I wasn't just fixing someone else's mess. I was fighting for what was mine. And I'd be damned if I was going to let them take it away. The lawsuit moved faster than I expected. Henry was like a bloodhound once he got his teeth into something. He chased every lead, poured over every line of that contract. He told me he wanted to make sure we didn't just win, but that we crushed them so completely they'd never try to pull a stunt like this again. About a month in, Henry called me late at night. Sam, you need to come by the office tomorrow, he said. We found something. It's big. I barely slept that night. My mind was racing with what it could be. Some hidden clause in the contract? Some overlooked detail that would tip the whole case in our favor? I drove to Henry's office first thing in the morning, the sky still dark over the mountains. He was waiting for me, a thick file sitting on his desk. They sent over their discovery documents, he said, flipping open the folder. and someone on their side slipped up. "Look at this." He handed me a printed-out email thread. My eyes scanned the page, the words blurring for a second before snapping into focus. It was a conversation between Elena, Joanne, and their lawyer, going back more than a year. "Elena, Sam's easy to distract. He'll keep working if we just keep promising him it's ours. Let him fix it up, then we can transfer it to Derek. Joanne, don't worry. He's mountain folk, hates the desert. He won't stick around after it's done anyway." And the lawyer, clear as day, "Once he's finished the renovations, we can say we changed our minds. There's no legal reason to share ownership if he's just volunteering." I read those words over and over, my hands shaking. Every line was a punch in the gut. All those months I'd spent in the sun, breathing in desert dust, believing that if I just worked hard enough, they'd see me as part of the family. This was what they really thought of me. Free labor. A fool. Henry watched me, his face calm but his eyes hard. "These emails change everything," he said quietly. "They prove intent. Premeditated fraud, Sam. And it's not just a breach of contract anymore. It's malicious." I nodded, but my mind was a blur of betrayal and relief. I'd suspected it for months, but seeing it written down in black and white was something else. It was like I could finally stop questioning my own memory, stop wondering if I'd imagined how cold Elena's voice had gotten, how Victor's handshake had started to feel like an empty promise. The next hearing, Henry presented the emails to the judge. Victor and Joanne's lawyer tried to argue it was a misunderstanding, that the emails were informal and lacked context. But the judge wasn't buying it. He looked over his glasses at their lawyer and said, "This isn't a misunderstanding. This is a deliberate attempt to defraud the plaintiff." I sat there in that courtroom, watching Victor's face go red, Joanne's lips pinched tight. Elena didn't even look at me. She just stared at her lap like she was wishing she could disappear. They offered me a settlement that afternoon. Henry told me they'd proposed a number that would cover most of what I'd spent, plus a little extra. "It's not a bad offer," he said, "but it's nowhere near what you're owed." I didn't even have to think about it. "No deal," I said. "I'm not letting them walk away like this." Henry smiled, just a little. "Good," he said, "because I was hoping you'd say that." That night, I sat on my porch with a cold beer in hand, the contract and those emails spread out on the table in front of me. The desert was a long way off, but I could still feel the heat of it in my bones. And for the first time in months, I felt something close to peace. They tried to turn me into a cautionary tale, some poor guy who got suckered by his own family. But I wasn't going to let that happen. Not now. Not ever. The day of the trial felt like something out of a dream. The kind of day you know is going to change everything, no matter how it turns out. I got up before the sun, my hands already shaking, and tried to calm myself by going through my notes one more time. Every receipt, every email, every detail I'd written in those journals over 2 years, I'd be ready. The courtroom was small and felt colder than it should have for such a big moment. Elena sat across from me, her eyes fixed on the table in front of her. Victor looked calm at first, but I could see his jaw working every time Henry spoke. Joanne kept dabbing at her eyes with the tissue, like she was the real victim here. And Derek, he didn't even show up. He was out of town, apparently, but we all knew he was just hiding from the fallout. Henry took the floor first. He laid out everything in that steady, measured voice of his, how I'd worked every weekend for 2 years, how I'd kept track of every dollar and hour I put in, how I'd done it all because of that signed agreement. Then he brought up the emails, the ones that made my stomach twist every time I read them. "This wasn't an accident," Henry said, his voice ringing through the courtroom. "This was a scheme. They used Sam's labor and trust to fix up their property, then tried to cut him out entirely when it was convenient for them." Elena's lawyer tried to spin it. He said the emails were just casual banter, that family conversations aren't always literal, that they never meant to cut me out. But the judge wasn't buying it. He leaned back in his chair and stared at Elena and Victor like he was trying to figure out how they could sleep at night. Victor finally took the stand. He tried to put on that charm of his, the same tone he'd used to convince me the motel would be mine too. "We're family," he said, almost pleading. This wasn't supposed to be some cold business transaction. Henry didn't even let him finish. "Family doesn't scheme to steal from someone, Victor," he said, his voice as cold as I'd ever heard it. "Family doesn't lie in writing and then hope it won't come back to haunt them." When it was my turn, I took a deep breath and tried to keep my voice steady. I told them about the heat, the hours I spent scraping paint and fixing pipes, the nights I lay awake in that motel wondering if I was making a huge mistake. I didn't have fancy words or lawyer talk. I just told the truth. The judge watched me the whole time. He didn't interrupt, didn't look away. And when I finished, he nodded once, like he'd already made up his mind. In the end, it was quick. "This contract is clear," he said, his voice steady and final. "The plaintiff is entitled to his share of the property as agreed, plus damages for the deliberate fraud committed by the defendants." Victor closed his eyes like the air had been knocked out of him. Joanne's shoulders slumped forward, and she started to cry for real this time. Elena just sat there, still as stone, like she couldn't quite believe it was over. A court-ordered sale was approved, and the proceeds would be split, my legal share protected by the judgment. Derek's name was nowhere in it. Just like that, he was out of the picture as quickly as he'd swooped in. I thought maybe Elena would say something, an apology, a last-ditch attempt to save face. But she didn't. She just stared at me like she didn't even recognize me anymore. A couple of days after the judgment, she served me divorce papers. They were neat and impersonal, like a final slap in the face. The irony wasn't lost on me. She'd spent years telling me the motel would bring us closer together. In the end, it was the thing that finally broke us apart. As I left the courthouse that day, I felt a strange calm wash over me. Like I'd finally let go of something I'd been carrying for too long. The motel wasn't mine entirely, and I didn't know what the future looked like. But for the first time in a long while, I felt like I was free. Free of their schemes. Free of their lies. Free to start over, even if it meant starting from scratch. And that, I realized, was worth more than any desert motel ever could be. A few weeks after the trial, when I thought I could finally let out a breath, another shoe dropped. It came on a Thursday morning when I was at the shop, working on an old Ford that hadn't run right in years. My phone buzzed with a number I didn't recognize. I almost ignored it, but something told me to pick up. The voice on the other end was calm, almost too polite. Sam Miller? My name's Tom Hamilton. I'm a lender who had some dealings with Victor Santiago a while back. I wiped the grease from my hands, frowning. I'm listening. He cleared his throat. I thought you should know Victor took out a loan against that motel just a few months before you finished the renovations. Used it as collateral. We've been trying to contact him, but he's elusive. A cold, heavy feeling settled in my gut. He took out a loan? I asked. While I was fixing the place? Yes, Tom said. A significant one. He put the motel up as collateral, which means the debt has to be paid before any sale can finalize. It's substantial. I felt my stomach clench. Of course, Victor would try to squeeze out every last drop of profit. I should have seen it coming. After we hung up, I drove straight to Henry's office, the documents Tom had sent burning a hole in my passenger seat. Henry read them slowly, his mouth tight. This changes things, he said finally. Victor didn't just try to cut you out. He was planning to cash in on your work before you ever saw a dime. He filed an emergency motion in court the next day. The judge listened to our case, looked over the loan documents, and didn't even hesitate. This is a clear case of financial fraud, he said. The motel will be sold, and the debts paid out of Victor and Joanne's share before any distribution to them. Sam's portion remains protected. I watched Victor and Joanne's faces as the judge spoke. Victor's pale and pinched, Joanne's lips trembling like she might break down at any second. Elena wasn't there, but I heard later she'd lost her job when those damning emails resurfaced. Derek? He vanished as soon as the judgment came down. No more big plans, no more music career. He just slinked off, like he'd never been part of this in the first place. When the court-ordered sale finally went through, most of Victor and Joanne's share was devoured by debt and legal fees. They got next to nothing in the end, just enough to pay off what they owed and keep their heads above water for a little while. I got my clean payout, fair and square, finally free of their twisted sense of family. A few days later, I stood outside the motel one last time, watching as the new owners took over. They were a young couple from Santa Fe, full of ideas about yoga retreats and desert wellness packages. I wished them luck, truly. It was their story now, not mine. On the drive back to Colorado Springs, I stopped at a gas station off the highway, the desert wind hot on my face. I took a moment to breathe, to feel that dry air and let it roll off me. And for the first time in what felt like forever, I didn't feel like I was drowning. They tried to turn me into nothing. Just another set of hands to build their dream. But I'd come out with my dignity, my share of the payout, and the knowledge that I'd never let anyone use me like that again. As I pulled back onto the highway, I felt something in my chest start to settle. A quiet kind of strength. I'd fought for what was mine and won. And in the end, that was enough. After the final checks cleared, I packed up what I needed and left the motel behind for good. The payout was enough for a fresh start, nothing extravagant, but enough to feel like I wasn't starting from zero. I used it to buy a modest house with a little workshop out back, just outside of Colorado Springs. A place I could call my own. The first few weeks felt strange. For so long, every weekend had been claimed by that motel. My hands, my back, my time, everything had gone into it. Now, my time was mine again. I spent the mornings working on small engine projects in the shop. Afternoons planting a few fruit trees in the yard. Evenings on the porch with a beer, watching the sun dip behind the mountains. It was quiet, and it felt like exactly what I needed. I started reconnecting with people I'd lost touch with along the way. My brother, David, showed up one afternoon, a six-pack of beer in one hand and a sheepish grin on his face. We drifted apart after our folks passed, each of us stubborn in our own way, but we sat on my porch until the sky turned black, talking about everything and nothing. It was the first time in years I didn't feel like I had to prove anything to anyone. One morning, I found a postcard in the mailbox. No return address, just an old photo of the motel, before any of the work I'd done. The pool cracked and empty, the sign half-lit and flickering in the dusk. On the back, in messy handwriting, it said, "Hope it was worth it." I stared at that message for a long time. Maybe it was from Derek, or maybe from Victor or Elena trying to take one last jab. I didn't know. And I realized, standing there in the morning light, that I didn't care. I smiled, a small, genuine smile. It was worth it. Every busted knuckle and sleepless night. Not for the motel, not for them, but because it taught me exactly who I was. I took the postcard out back to the fire pit I'd built, crumpled it up, and watched the flames eat away the paper. The crackle and hiss felt like a final goodbye. Then I went back inside and opened up my old notebook. The one I'd used to plan every inch of that motel, every expense and repair. I turned to a fresh page and wrote at the top in big, block letters, "My own damn life." I didn't know exactly what came next, but for the first time in years, I felt like I was in control of my story again. And that was more than enough.